Can you? So the topic that I wanted to focus on today is the topic of predetermination and destiny. Now, whenever we're talking about a subject, we can, and not just within satsang, but anywhere when you're talking out there, we often have a conversation and a topic comes up and we start talking about the topic. And we can lose track of why we're talking about that topic and in relation to what, in relation to what broader point. And if we lose track of what we're talking about a topic, in what relationship we're talking about a topic, then the conversation can sort of go in any direction, and it can, people can argue over a point or a perspective about a certain topic because they're looking at that topic relative to different primary objects or primary topics. And so talking about predetermination, I'm not talking about predetermination as an absolute topic where the important thing is to understand whether life is predetermined or not. I'm not writing a paper on predetermination per se, but rather talking about predetermination as it relates to happiness for the human being. And when it comes to happiness for the human being, which really boils down to an attitude towards life, an attitude towards circumstance as it unfolds, taking the view that life is a predetermined story unfolding is very relevant. It is appropriate to look at life as a predetermined story unfolding. Even if from some other perspective relative to some other topic, looking at life as predetermined can not serve a very good purpose. And in fact, it could be argued from another perspective that life isn't predetermined. However, what we need to understand is that that is the importance of understanding why we're talking about something relative to a certain point. And even if someone can come up with holes in the argument that life is predetermined relative to some other topic, relative to happiness in daily living, it holds. And someone might say, well, don't we need to know that something is absolutely that way? And that's what our thinking wants. Our thinking is designed to want certainty. Our thinking is designed to think that life is one way. And it wants to be able to wrap itself around life and understand life. And that's actually a flaw in thinking. So this is the point that's made in the teaching. There is a concept that says whatever is put forward in writing or in speech, any time in the past, in the present, or in the future, or anything that was said in the past, which at the time was the present, but has always just been a concept, not the truth. Meaning that we can always look at what is said and find an opposite concept, and many times the opposite concept is also true, is also accurate, is also valid. And when our thinking doesn't look at things like that and it wants one truth, what we end up missing is layers of life. And it's not really missing the layers of life, it's missing a capacity to look at life in a multi-layered way. And we need to start, our thinking needs to open up. It needs to lose its rigidity if we're going to find our thinking becomes appropriate to understand life more truly. Now, that doesn't mean understand it with an intellectual concept that says this is the truth, but come to be able to flow and move with life. We need a thinking that is less rigid. So I'll give you an example of this. And the example is in itself an interesting topic. So I'm going to sort of go off track a little bit to talk about an interesting topic, because this is an attitude that we really need to develop. And that is that everybody is right. From the perspective of happiness, we need to be able to see everybody as right. Especially those with a different view to us, a different set of ideologies to us, a different set of preferences to us, a different set of personalities and ways of living to us, different belief structures to us. To be able to see them as right. And our thinking will say, no, if someone believes something that I fundamentally disbelieve, let's say I've given it lots of thought, and after giving it lots of thought, I've put that option aside and says, I can't subscribe to that way of looking at a situation. So we can look back in history, for example, and see slavery, and now slavery, with the benefit of hindsight, has been seen to be a thing that is no longer appropriate, wasn't with our eyes, was never appropriate. But at the time, it had its place because of the way people were seeing life. So if you were to find a modern day version, so there were people back then that were clear it's not appropriate, and then others were defending it. So if you find a modern day version of that, and let's say you're on the side of the equivalent of saying slavery is not appropriate. So you see something today, so it's not appropriate. How can we see people on the other side of the argument as right? Because we need to be able to, as far as happiness for the human being goes. Yes, you're right. And it doesn't need to be said, it needs to be felt. if we see the other as right, we can't argue with them. We can only argue with someone if we see them as wrong. So on what level do we have to be able to see everyone and everything as right? It's not meant to be on that we see everyone right on all. And this is why I'm using this as an example of how our thinking needs to loosen up, stop being rigid. Our thinking has become very one-layered, or everything relative to me. And life can be seen and has layers to it. And so when you're looking at a particular layer, it's going to have that layer is going to have different characteristic, different rules to another layer. So in simplistic terms, we can say, okay, well, there is a layer of life that is the physical. And then there is another layer, which is thought. So that's an example of two layers, physical and thought, and there are different properties on the two layers. And so if you mix up properties that exist on one layer and don't realize it's one layer and meld them together, then the thinking tries to understand what is two layers as one single layer, let's say. And there's a whole lot of confusion. So our thinking needs to become less rigid. And so on a layer of seeing that right and wrong from a particular perspective ceases to exist. From a layer that sees all of life as a creation, as a happening, then even the most painful is the interconnected opposite for the most pleasurable. And so both pleasure and pain become part of the whole, that you can't take one away and be left with the whole. They both need to be there in order for the whole to exist. Now, if we look at that from the perspective of the body-mind organism with its biological preferences, we can't accept interconnected opposites of pleasure and pain as part of the whole and valid. Because to the body-mind organism with its biological preferences, on the layer of the body, pain is an attack on the level of the body. Pain is a diminishing component of the body. And so from the body's point of view, pleasure and pain can't be treated as equally valid. And we've become very identified with observing life from the perspective of the body-mind organism that knows itself in a very rigid way. So if we can understand that from the perspective of the body-mind organism, there is a difference between pleasure and pain. One is appreciated and the other is not appreciated by the body. So that's a layer. So we can't pretend, or we shouldn't pretend, that pleasure and pain don't exist. We shouldn't pretend that pleasure and pain are part of the whole from the perspective of the body-mind organism. From the perspective of the body-mind organism, there is a preference for one and a preference for the absence. And so we need to acknowledge that and keep that as the rule on that layer. So on that layer, the body-mind organism will have a concept that it has chosen out of two concepts. So slavery and the abolition of slavery. And let's say the body-mind organism with its working mind has said, I am for the abolition of slavery, the end of slavery. So on that level, the concept that says, I am for slavery, is not going to be seen as right. And we shouldn't try to make it be seen as right. We need to, on the layer of, on a certain aspect of life, the relativity must be appreciated. The preference for the interconnected opposites of pleasure and pain, the preference for pleasure must be appreciated. The preference for a certain concept, a certain way of seeing life must be appreciated. And therefore, on that layer, we won't agree with what someone says. So what I mean is, if a particular working mind understands that the square root of 64 is 8, or understands that 8 squared is 64. And so if someone else says, no, 8 squared is 16, and this body-mind organism understands, no, 8 times 2 is 16, but 8 squared means 8 times 8, it's 64. And so if the other person keeps insisting, no, 8 squared is 16, I can understand on the level of the body-mind organism that there is a misunderstanding from my perspective. I have to wonder whether I've got it right. We have to keep that in mind, but assume there is a strong degree of certainty that I understand 8 squared, which means 8 times 8, and it's 64, and can understand how that person is making a mistake because, let's say, maths is not their strong point. So on that level, they are not right, and I wouldn't, we're not condoning to say you have to see the other as right. So you have to see that when they say 8 squared is 16, you don't look at it and say, oh yes, you're right. However, if we only see life from the perspective of you're right or you're wrong relative to specific benchmarks, if that's the only way we see it, then anyone who agrees with us is on our side, right? Anyone who agrees that this 8 squared is 64 is on our side. Anyone who thinks 8 squared is anything but 64 is wrong, not on my side. And now we have separation. Separation because we can only see in black and white. And we only see on one layer. On the layer where I am saying it's 64, they're saying it's 16 or any other number. And there is only one right and everything else is wrong. So that means that there is separation, meaning two sides that you can be on, my side or the other side. If we can open up our understanding of life, feel life on more than one layer, we might be able to appreciate that from the perspective I just described, yes, 64 is the right answer and 16 and any other number is the wrong answer. However, can I see that that person is a valid expression of life, that that person exists only because life has conspired, life has agreed, life has said, yes, they are to exist. And life has said, yes, they are to run with the fact that 8 squared is 16. Just like the people back in the day that were pro-slavery were there because life conspired, life agreed to them being there. And life insisted that they have that view. And this needs to be seen, not just a concept that says, oh yes, life conspired for them to be here. They're only here because life agreed to it. And so therefore they are valid. That can be understood intellectually, and we can go, oh, yeah, that's an interesting argument. But the understanding of how it is that nothing that exists in life is separate from life and essentially made of the essence of life, because it's not separate of life. So we can look at the essence of everything as life. The wood is life, the stone is life, the people are life, the red-haired people, the dark-haired people, the blonde people, all life. The people that agree with the left is life, and the people that agree with the right is life. The essence of everything is life. And the more we can see that the essence of everything is life, and that life essence manifests in different expressions, in different form. But if you boil all the forms down to a lowest common denominator, you get life. And so once again, I could give you more and more elaborate concepts that are pointing at the oneness of life, the validity of everything that arises in life, because it's part of life. So if a comet was heading towards Earth and it was going to wipe out humanity, that's life. The comet is life, humanity is life. And when the comet hits and humanity gets wiped out, all that remains is life. So before there was life and after there was life. And it's only from the perspective of the human that wants life to be a certain way that that is not valid. And when we see it as not valid, we see it as not life, which means we have an attitude of separating out life and not life, or the life that is valid and that which is not valid. So we need to sort of pull out of the personal and contemplate on the bigger picture point of view for the descriptions that I'm putting forward, which are essentially it's a description of non-separation, it's a description of oneness, it's a description of non-duality. And then you can listen to other mystical teachings, Rumi poems, Ramana Maharshi teaching, and they will be describing the oneness of life in their different ways. And all those different descriptions can help adjust things, give us food for thought. But in the end, we're going to have to start seeing, really seeing, feeling that everything is made of life, and that we are life, and that what sees life is life. And so one of the most tangible ways of recognizing the oneness of life is by focusing on the awareness aspect of life. So we could talk about the energy essence of everything. And we could say that boil everything, life down to energy, moving, pulsating frequency or energy. The problem with that is that that lowest common denominator of life is very valid. Theoretically, that is a commonality of everything in life. And so it has its place to call everything energy. There is faculty that functions through us in each moment that is more experientially available than vibrating energy. Now, when I say this, it's not entirely correct. Vibrating energy is something that we could argue we can feel. But even when we feel what we might call vibrating energy, I would suggest it's probably not the energy that is spoken about, for example, in science, that will reduce all of life down to energy. I would suggest that the energy that we can feel is much more directly related with something we could call consciousness. And an aspect of consciousness is awareness. And if we focus on the awareness aspect, that can flower into a tangible appreciation that all of life, all of the different forms of life are made of awareness. That all the different forms of life are essentially awareness in different form. Awareness in different expressions. So even if it is valid to find a different lowest common denominator in life as one with, so a different common denominator to consciousness or awareness, in Advaita teachings, the lowest common denominator of choice is awareness, consciousness. And we can get a real sense if we find a contemplating, a willingness, an earnestness, an enthusiasm, a dedication to being able to know more directly, more deeply, life as one than we have done in the past. There is a capacity for there to be an experiential appreciation for the oneness of life through recognizing everything as an expression of awareness. Now, because I started off talking about how life has layers, I would emphasize that what I've just said, that life is all awareness, is not an absolute truth. That the lowest common denominator of life is awareness is not an absolute truth, because you might also notice I said you could find other lowest common denominators by which to see the oneness of life. Now, a lowest common denominator is similarity. So there can't be several of them. However, there could be a lowest common denominator on different layers of life. So that means the lowest common denominator that is specific to a specific layer of life. And so I'm choosing the lowest common denominator on the layer of perception or experience. So let's remember what all this talking we go here. It was about I started off saying that we have to open up, shake our way of seeing life, our way of thinking about things. Our thinking has become very rigid. Our thinking has been formed very much by the experience, and the experience, in a way, doesn't reveal layers until we start looking deeper. And the looking requires the intellect to help show us the layers, show us the depth of life. And I was talking there is right and wrong, and that is very valid. That on one layer we are the instrument that has preferences, and therefore some things are going to be in line with our preferences and other things not in line with our preferences. On that layer, we have concepts that we hold as accurate, or the ones that resonate with us, and concepts that we say, I don't think that's accurate, or at least I don't resonate with that concept. I don't stand on the side of that concept. I stand on the side of this concept. And that is valid. That is not separation. That it becomes separation if we only exist and see life on that layer, on that layer and from that perspective. Simultaneous to being able to take a position of saying, I agree with, we also need to be able to simultaneously and not switch and forget about the relative layer, but find an appreciation that life, from a broader perspective, is a singularity, is a whole, is a one, is a creation. Like a fruit on a tree, the fruit grows, and it grows as a singularity. And the fruit may have different components in it: seeds, pulp, juice, skin. And the whole, all of those layers are part of the one fruit. And so you can look at the specific components of the fruit. So you can look at the seed, and the seed is on that layer separate from the pulp. And the seed and the pulp is separate from the juice. And you go out further and you see that the fruit as a whole includes all of the components, and none of the components are separate. When you look at them from one layer, the juice is separate from the pulp, and the pulp is separate from the seed. From the outer layer, you see that they are all the one fruit, and therefore the separation dissolves. It doesn't actually dissolve, but it dissolves from that perspective. Our attitude needs to be an attitude that develops an appreciation from this broader perspective. Our attitude to life must be the attitude that appreciates that everything has its place. Even the ideas that from the layer that is not this broad picture perspective, even those ideas that are not what we subscribe to, from this outer level, they are as valid as the ideas we subscribe to. And we need to have one foot in that perspective, one foot on that outer layer, and another foot in the relative. So with one foot in the relative, we can have a discussion about how we disagree with the other person's concept. We can have a discussion about how 8 squared is not 16, but 8 squared is 64. And with our foot on the other layer, we can see how the discussion is all part of life. The insistence of the other that 8 squared is 16 is part of life. The arguments that are put forward that says, no, it's 64 is part of life. The frustration that arises on the relative level is part of life. The anger that might arise on behalf of the other, or the shame, is all part of life. And that is what is being seen from that outer attitude. So the outer attitude can witness the movements of one particular body-mind organism, can witness the movements of another particular body-mind, and see the whole thing as a singular movement of life. And from that attitudinal perspective, which is not the attitude of the mind, it can sound like it is an attitude which is really a belief that says, oh yeah, that is valid. That is part of life. It can sound like what I'm talking about is a belief or a set of mental thoughts towards life, where when something hurts us, we say, yes, but that is also part of life as a thought. And that's not what happens when you have one foot on this layer that sees everything as one. The shift, the qualitative change that happens is a dropping into an aspect of the human being that exists on that outer level. So when I use the metaphor of having one foot on the outer layer that sees everything as one, how that foot is placed on that layer is by a dropping out of thinking into what we can call being. That is the establishing of the foot on this outer layer. When the foot is established on the outer layer, then the dropping out of thinking is not really so needed, because remember, the witnessing of life as one includes the witnessing of a discussion that may be explaining how 8 squared doesn't mean 8 times 2, which equals 16, but 8 squared means 8 times that very number. So in this case, 8 times 8, which is 64. And that explanation is thinking. Now, what I had just said is that to establish the foot on the outer level, we need to drop out of thinking into the realm of this other layer. And this realm exists as an aspect of the human being. And to establish the stepping of the foot into that layer, dropping out of thinking is what is often needed. Which really means a dropping of the habit to explain or argue or hold on to one's position that 8 squared is 64, just for a while. So for a while, we are not going to live balanced, integrated human lives, because the thinking that exists on the relative level has become too ingrained for us to be able to entertain it. for this period of establishing our foot on the outer perspective, the outer realm of life, where life is known as a singularity, where life is known as a non-duality, as a oneness, where everything is part of life. And why is this important? It's important because the knowing of life as one needs to be there in order for us to genuinely see the other as right, to genuinely see both the positive and the negative, the good and the bad, the kind and the unkind, the wealth and the poverty, the health and the disease in life as equally valid. For us to genuinely feel at peace with the duality of life, to genuinely feel at peace with however circumstance unfolds, requires us to know deeply the oneness of life. And this knowing is not an intellectual knowing. It can be aided by the intellectual descriptions. The intellectual concepts, the intellectual descriptions are put forward to inspire the thinking to essentially create a conceptual platform that allows a conceptual stepping back out of the thinking that only sees life as binary, black and white, on and off, duality, where we agree with one and disagree with the other. So that's the psychological setup that has been put in place. And in order for us to extract ourselves from that way of seeing life, the intellect needs to build a conceptual platform which is closer to this realm that I'm speaking of. Now, the conceptual platform is not the realm I'm speaking of, but it is close enough that we will be able to drop into that realm. Whereas from the conceptual platform that sees life as binary, we can't drop into the realm of being one with life. So the intellectual descriptions, the concepts, are there to allow us to create a platform to step onto. So a good example of a teaching concept that helps us build a platform to step onto is the concept that says, in deep sleep, as well as in the waking state and the dream state, there is awareness that is aware of all three. Awareness that is ever present and unchanging, that is that which is aware of the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. It's a beautiful concept. It's a beautiful concept that allows a loosening of our thinking to create a possibility of understanding the waking state, meaning the experience of life, the dream state, and the deep sleep states as objects. That concept objectifies the three states and then creates an imaginary subject within the concept. When I say imaginary, because the whole the dream state, the deep sleep state, and the waking state is imaginary in the concept. In the concept, it doesn't exist. Waking state, dream state, and deep sleep are part and parcel of the concept of the description. And the awareness of those three doesn't exist either. It comes into existence within the concept. It is created by the fact that the concept says an awareness is that which is aware of the three states that are described as words, essentially, in the concept. And our thinking can create an image of what is described. Now, that image is not the thing itself, but that image gives us a stepping stone to go beyond the concept and maybe experience life, which is the waking state, from a perspective that was described in the concept, a perspective that wasn't available to us before. And so the concept is not the truth. The concept is allowing the intellect that receives the concept to create a platform on which to step. And then maybe from that platform, we find ourselves falling back into the actuality, into the experience of what the concept is describing. And often we don't realize how the teachings have worked on us. And if we don't realize that what has happened is a concept has been received and we have created an intellectual platform, an intellectual reconstruction of the concept. And it's only after having stood on that new platform, which means having extracted ourselves from the old belief system and put a foot onto the new platform, the new conceptual platform, which at that point didn't feel particularly significant. The experience didn't change significantly. That is the point get frustrated, where they say, I understand what you're saying. I understand that you're saying awareness is that which is aware of the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. And yet, I can't feel it. I don't know it. Because the falling back into the knowing hasn't happened. And if we keep thinking that the concept is where we will know it, we keep strengthening the concept, saying, okay, well, I must have to understand it a bit better. I have to understand the concept. And we might keep like refining the concept, thinking that it's in refining the concept and understanding the concept intellectually that we will get it. And in fact, it's a stepping stone. And so the stepping stone doesn't need to be perfectly refined. It can be fairly rough and we can fall back into it. So the refining of it is not what gets us to fall back into the knowing of it. What allows us to fall into the knowing of it is to realize it isn't about refining the concept more and more and more and more, and then finally, when the concept is perfect, I will know it. It's understanding, the concept is getting me closer to being able to see what is pointed at, to see it directly and for myself. But in order for that to happen, I need to drop out of the concept once I'm standing on that platform. And that is the equivalent of falling back. Now, all of this sounds like something you have to do. The intellect says, okay, I'm going to do the falling back. Then that is essentially creating an image of falling back within that conceptual image, which is never going to be the falling back. In fact, it's going to be the keeping one in the conceptual image. So this awareness that is aware of life is here right now. It isn't something we're going to touch in our head in the concept. The concept is pointing us to the waking state. The concept said awareness is that which is aware of the waking state, meaning the content, the experience in the waking state, the content and experience in dream state, and for the sake of the concept, the content and experience in deep sleep. Awareness is that which knows all the three states. So it is referred to as Turiya, the fourth state. The fourth state is not a fourth state separate from the first three, but that state which is aware of the first three. So it is the overriding background in which the other three states arise. There is even talk of a fifth state, Turiyatitya. But that's just another platform, a conceptual platform for us to understand that there is potentially something even beyond that which is aware of the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. So the concept is pointing us to that which is here, that which will be known outside of thinking. So maybe a quietening down of thinking, which is keeping us on either the original platform of seeing everything as either right or wrong, depending on whether it's in line with how we see things or in line with our preferences, and dividing everything. It either keeps us there, or the thinking keeps us on the new platform that says, well, actually, both those things we like, those things that are in line with our preferences, and those things which aren't, are part of the whole. So that new platform is really saying, actually, there is no such thing as good and bad. Good and bad only makes sense relative to the you on that level. We want to know ourselves on the broader level. And so on the broader level, the notion of good and bad doesn't exist. All that exists is one, which is the one is the arising of both the good and the bad, but seen from a perspective where the interest in what arises in each moment, whether arises good or bad, which is a relative concept to the body-mind organism. From this other perspective, it's like, who cares? Awareness essentially doesn't care what the content is. Awareness is just aware of the whole. So whether it is black or white or a mix of colors, that is just difference. In principle, it's the same, it's content. And awareness is just aware of content. It doesn't really have an interest in what content. It's like a salesman. Doesn't care what they're selling. They're just a salesman. Give me something, I'll sell it. I'll sell steak knives. I'll sell guns. I'll sell medical aids. I'll sell beliefs. Doesn't matter. You give me the product, I'll come up with a sales pitch and sell it. Awareness is, doesn't matter what the content is. My job is just to be aware. Put good stuff in there. Put painful stuff, pleasurable stuff, emotions, thoughts, nature, cityscape, whatever. Illness, good health, wealth, poverty, male, female. It's, to me, it's, whatever. Come up, do your best, create whatever you like. I'm just going to be aware of it. Witness it. And the witnessing is not happening from the body-mind organism. It's not happening through the eyes and the ears and the mouth. The seeing isn't happening through the eyes. The awareness that we change, if we use the word seeing, it can keep us identified with visual recognition. Awareness is much broader, a broader recognition of life in its entirety. It knows life as you could describe it as a multi-sensory, multi-dimensional experience, including more than just senses, including thought and emotion and feeling. And there is an awareness that is aware of the whole lot from a perspective beyond the body-mind organism. The body-mind organism exists on the relative level. And so for as long as the thinking happens, which is a function on the relative level, until there is an establishment of ourself on the aspect of the human that is outside of the relative, until that happens, if the thinking continues, we are confined to seeing life from the relative perspective. And so for a while, thinking needs to be disencouraged. And so how can we know what that concept is pointing at? The concept of awareness, aware of the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state, and realize how the concept can create an imagination where we imagine the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. Now, the dream state and the deep sleep state don't exist here. So we can see how we get propelled into a concept, into thinking. And we might actually believe the concept to be truth, whereas truth is this. So that's not saying that that concept is wrong and we shouldn't, because creating an imagination of that which is aware simultaneously of the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state, not really simultaneously, because only one of those presents at a time. So it's if the deep sleep state is presenting, then waking state and dream state are in the off position. If the dream state is presenting, then deep sleep and waking are in the off position. And the concept is saying what we are, our true nature, the true essence of life, is awareness. The awareness that witnesses whatever arises as life in that moment, waking state, dream state, or deep sleep. So the concept helps creating imagination that can then maybe get us to see, to know that in the waking state. Don't worry about the dream state or the deep sleep state. It's not about knowing the deep sleep state from this point of awareness. That's what I mean by the concept is not necessarily truth. When we hear the concept, we think, oh, what I have to do is know the deep sleep state, because that's what the concept is talking about. What I need is to know the dream state from this perspective of what I am, that which is aware of the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. I suggest don't worry, but think about the dream state and the deep sleep state as objects that take the place of the waking state from time to time. Then realize that what you have in front of you now, what you are part of now, is the waking state. And be interested in knowing the waking state from the point of view of awareness, remembering that the body and the thinking and the emotions are all part of the waking state, are all part of the content. And you are that which is aware of the waking state, that which, when the waking state collapses, which means when the body collapses and the emotions collapse and the thoughts collapse and the objects of life collapse, you are still that which is aware of whatever takes the place of the waking state. You are that which is aware of the dream state, which will include body of the main character of the dream, which there will be some sense of being. You will have a sense that I am that character. And then there might be a witnessing of the dream from this perspective where you are not the character, but that which is aware of the character. And so similarly in the waking state, remember the body is not what is looking. The body is part of the content that can be recognized, that can be awared, that can be known, that can be seen from a perspective outside of the content. And should that happen, it will become apparent that all of the content is not at all as objectively real as we have known it, as we have experienced it in the past. It will be recognized as an appearance that which seems like it is objective form is replaced in the next moment by new form. And if we see that form can't just dissolve if it was form, so if it is replaced by something new, then we might start to understand that that isn't really form. It is appearance appearing as form. It is experience appearing as form. And the experience of time and space is also part of the construct. This is not really to be thought about. And if it's going to be known, it's going to be known if the thinking quietens down. The thinking will quieten down if it sinks in. I will never know the oneness of life through thought. I'll only know the oneness of life when the thinking that keeps me identified with the relative quietens down. To directly know experience of life, we don't need to think about it. So to come to the body as a starting place and to hear from the perspective of the body can be a starting place, because by hearing, we are bringing our attention into the present moment, that which is here now to be heard, and to see, starting from the perspective of the body, that which is here to be seen, and to smell that which is here to be smelt, and touch that which is here to be touched. And while smelling and hearing and seeing, let's bring attention to the experience so that we can tangibly or fully know the sense of the senses, the sight, be interested in the details, see the books on the bookshelf with more interest than before. Look at them, being interested to register how many books there are, whereas you might have been looking at that bookshelf for your whole life. And if someone says, how many different shelf compartments are there? You know, I don't know, maybe it's 6, could be 9. Actually, maybe it's 4 by 4, could be 16, might be 4 by 3. Maybe it's just 3 by 3. Well, I don't know. I haven't really registered that. So next time you look at the bookshelf, look at it with more interest. And that we don't need to have a lot of thinking that says, okay, now I'll remember it's 3 by 3, it's 9 different shelf compartments. I have to remember that. And let me count the books: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You don't need to memorize it. It's like being interested. You might forget about it afterwards. It's not about a pop quiz where someone's going to say, okay, now you have to tell me how many shelves there were and whatever. But look at it in a way where there's more possibility to know what was there, because you're actually seeing what's there in a way that maybe you've never done before. It's stop and smell the roses. Really smell them and be aware of the smell. And realize you don't need to do any thinking. You don't need to think about the oneness of life to be able to smell and experience. And so once there is a presence with the present moment, there might be an appreciation that everything is seen. And I like using the visual aspect, and realize that everything is known only because awareness is present. If I were able to flick a switch on you that turns off awareness, the appreciation, the existence as an experience of the room would collapse. Right? Just like, so there is the equivalent of the switch being turned off, the awareness being turned off, which is when we are under sedation with an anesthetic. When that happens, the awareness is lost, and the experience of pain, the experience of being aware and being awake is gone, which is why the body can be cut and an operation can happen, because awareness has withdrawn. So awareness is no longer there to register what is going on. So when you're present with life, appreciate that the only reason that the trees are seen, that the cars are seen, that the other people are seen, that your own body is recognized, that the thoughts are recognized, any contraction, if there's any contraction, any of that is known only because the faculty of awareness is there. And maybe realize that that faculty of awareness is ever present in life. You've never experienced life in the absence, meaning without awareness present. So when we are encouraged to be in the presence or to be present, it is the presence of awareness. And we can appreciate the presence of awareness by being present with the objects first. Bring our attention to the actual objects rather than being lost in thinking. Thinking is an object, but it's an object that is thinking about not what is here. So to recognize the awareness that is the background, the container of the life experience, it can be helpful to bring attention to that which is seen, that which is heard, and then appreciate that which is seen, that which is heard is all arising because the objects are contained within the field of awareness. This field of awareness is always here. And from the quiet witnessing, the being aware of what is, you can say, being aware of the movement of life without being the creator of it. If a bird flies past, or a dog runs into the room, or another person speaks, you are aware of creation happening. If you are honest and present with the experience, I didn't create the dog. I didn't make the moment unfold the way it unfolded. Not even the thoughts or the hiccups or the feelings of hunger that might arise, or emotions, the sadness, if there's sadness, all of that is content. And from the perspective of the silent witnessing of what is happening in life, it's perfectly obvious that life is a happening. Life is a creation, but not my doing, not my creating. That which is silently aware is aware of what is created. And that's not some conceptual idea of creation where we say source or God created this. It's being present with what is created, not knowing where it was created from, not knowing by what or by whom it was created, but knowing that what I am is that which is aware of it. Knowing that I am not that which created it. If you think you are that which created it, you're lost in belief, a belief that was inserted by a concept that said you are the creator because all there is one, and therefore you must be that which did everything, including created it. Now, theoretically, that may be accurate. Experientially, it is not something confirmable. So I suggest you question the concept, which because of the same error, in a way, of our thinking that I described before, where we take a concept and create an image, and then the image that we've created, we believe that that is the truth. We believe that that is the thing, and we see it because we are now seeing the image that the concept that we were given enabled us to create. And then we see the image, and then we think, oh, I understand, I see that I am the creator, which really means a new spiritual belief has set in. And this can happen with experiences that have happened. If an experience happens, we can carry that experience into the present moment and hold it as a belief about truth. And if we become really honest, we say, well, I don't know that experience that didn't feel like an experience. In what I'm talking about in most cases is it is an experience that doesn't feel like what we would call experience. It is an experience that, based on the new definitions we've been given about peak experiences, often related to reality, we would say, oh no, that was the end of experience, and that was the knowing of reality. And so then, with that confusion in our head, we will carry that that which we believe was revealed to us as truth into the present moment, thinking that we know what the truth is, even if it can't be felt and seen in this present moment. So all of that was coming back to, in the moment when we are silently witnessing the content of life as a creation, not knowing where it came from or what created it, but knowing what I am is that which is witnessing it. It is from this perspective that we can start looking at life as a singularity, meaning the experience, an experience that, when we look at it more closely from a more relative level, we see it's an experience with specific and a multitude of different forms, including thoughts, including emotions, including physical objects, and physical objects of different frequency. So physical objects made of stone, of wood, of plastic, of metal. And so the one experience includes all of these differences. And from the zoomed out version, we see, the differences are only apparent, you could say, are only existent from a certain perspective. Now, we shouldn't then say that perspective is not real or not as valid as the zoomed out version, because both the zoomed out version and the zoom in version are two layers of the whole. We have to learn to live with, when I say learn, we get changed by life such that the two layers merge and become the new one experience of life, meaning the experience of life that is lived on a relative level with one foot in what we could call the non-relative, the absolute, which is not really the absolute. It is a layer that has less relative qualities and can therefore seem more absolute relative to the relative, but it isn't the absolute, because if it was the absolute, we would have to make that truth, and then this becomes not truth, which is a new duality, a new separation. And so knowing that there are two layers means they have to be integrated at some point in order for the whole to be known, and that means a knowing of the two layers without confusing them. But for now, I've been talking about seeing the oneness, the content that on the micro level has difference, from the point where we can see that all of the difference is actually made of the same stuff, awareness. Why is it made of awareness? Because if you take awareness away, the whole thing collapses. Intellectually, that is an important piece of the puzzle. Is why is awareness and the object not two? They're not two because you will never experience the object independent of awareness being present. And you will never experience awareness independent of some object being there. I know a lot of people at certain places, certain train stations, will disagree with that statement, probably because they have believed the concept that says awareness is that which is aware of the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep, and taken that to be an absolute truth, and therefore said, well, awareness is that which is aware of all of the states. And so it is prior to the states. And therefore, awareness can be in the absence of an object. You might notice that deep sleep has been turned into an object when we talk about deep sleep. In the concept, it has been turned into an object that awareness is aware of. So if we can start to appreciate that the objects that were interpreted as being out there and having an independent existence are never out there. They're always in here. They're always interdependent on awareness. They have no independent existence away from awareness. Now, what I've just said there is not an absolute truth, because we could argue that if awareness is removed, the experience falls away, and yet the object may continue to exist even if there isn't awareness of it. So what we're focusing here is the experience of the objects. And so we can't confirm whether there is an object outside of the experience or not. The object that we experience, meaning the image, the experience of the object, may be a reflection of an actual object, or it may be all there is. The experience, the image may be all there is. Or it may be an image of an actual independent object. But what's important is to come to the experience and realize the experience of the lamp, the experience of the book, the experience of the other person is all we've ever known in life. Our life is experience, momentary experience, and that no objects of life, no objects of the experience of life exist independent of awareness. So that's what we can come to see, is the experience that we know as life is completely interdependent on awareness. And awareness is completely interdependent on the presence of life. If your mind is saying, no, awareness is not independent on the presence of life. Life might be be dependent, or the experience of life might be dependent on the presence of awareness, but awareness is not dependent on the presence of life. That's probably because a concept has been delivered that says reality, or that which is true, is awareness. And so if that concept has been set in, then in our thinking, we are forced to hold awareness as the absolute that has independent existence, because it is being described as truth or reality or what you are, unchanging. And so I suggest that you drop using the word awareness as the absolute truth and put some other word there. And then your thinking might realize that actually I know awareness only in its interdependent nature with objects. And that when the objects fall away, in experience, awareness falls away too. And we might see, oh, I was believing a concept and believing it to be my experience. That awareness exists independent of life, independent of object. And even if we've had an experience of awareness with no content of life, you might, if you can sense that, remember that experience, which a lot of people would struggle to agree was experience because it was a peak experience that didn't feel like the experience that is labeled experience. So there is a falling away of subject-object relationship in the awareness where there is no content. And yet you might realize that there was awareness of nothing. And what we call nothing was actually something. The nothing became the something. The nothing was that which the awareness was aware of as essentially something you can remember. And so our use of language is sometimes in need of further refinement, where we realize, oh, real nothing, absolute nothing, is the absence of the presence of nothing. So what we were calling nothing was the presence of nothing, which made it sort of something. And absolute nothing would be the absence of something. So nothing we can call the absence of something. And absolute nothing is the absence of something. And in the absence of something, which is negating even that experience that someone might have, there was awareness of nothing. It's saying real nothing is the absence of that. In that, there's no question of awareness. That is the collapse of awareness. Now, by default, that's not something that will ever be known, because what is there to know it if even awareness collapses? But if you ask me, that is, if you're going to have a conceptual model, that is the most poetic and the most appropriate source to stick at as the absolute. The absolute is the absence of even nothing. So if you enjoy getting your head messed up with that, then I suggest Wei Wu Wei is the teaching for you. So in that teaching, something is the presence of presence. Nothing is the absence of presence, which really means the awareness of nothing. So you have the presence of presence, which is the waking state. The absence of presence, which is deep sleep. Or you can flip it and say the presence of absence. So the presence of presence, the presence of absence. And the truth is the absence of the presence of presence and the absence of the presence of absence. And in the absence of the presence of presence and the absence of presence, there's no question of awareness. But that's not where happiness is to be found. So don't worry about that. It's not something that will ever be known to anyone or anything, not even God knows that has just been put into a concept. In that state, God is not even aware of itself. Where happiness is to be found is in the manifestation. What we're looking for is happiness for the human being. So it is good enough to know what we can call the absolute in the manifestation. Therefore, is not really the absolute, because there is theoretically something prior to it, which is not knowable. So if you can't see the other is right, if you can't feel a place from where you can rest and know that the idea that is in opposition with the idea that you as a particular body mind holds is not an attack on who you are. When you can rest as that, then once the interaction in the moment has ended, it dissolves. It is not carried forward in time, because you will rest in that aspect of the human being that one is remaining present, and two is not identified with what happened as being significant in defining what we are. So from this perspective, we can start to see life as a predetermined story happening. Now, predetermined from the perspective of the witness, we see what happens when it arises. And so from the perspective of the witness, it couldn't be different, because it isn't different. We could only say it could theoretically be different, because in theory it could have been anything. But once the theory of potentiality actualizes, means it condenses down into something, that which is presenting in the present moment, then the attitude from that which is aware of it is that was what was predetermined. Meaning, from my perspective, being not the one that created it, and being the one that is aware of it after it arises, then I say, my awareness of it is the awareness of something that happened before, so it was determined before. Determined before I know it. And so whatever happens in life is always the same. From the perspective of the witness, and even from the perspective of the human being, what happened is what manifested, what actualized out of the form of infinite potentiality. And so whether each moment is actualizing and nothing else exists except for the present moment, even if that is what has happened, then the present moment is with, and from that perspective, it is predetermined. Means that what arose was not my creation. It was created, and only after it was created was there awareness of it. And so whether we look at it as each moment is predetermined, or whether we look at the whole of time and space, which, even though we experience it as linear, when we start diving into makeup, we might start to appreciate that it's not necessarily as linear. And that's why the notion of predetermined, which in itself implies linear and time, because pre means before something. The notion of life as a spontaneous arising can mean the spontaneous arising of all of life as a block from the beginning of time to the end of time, which really means no time. And so the notion of predetermination is a concept relative to happiness for the human being. And as I said, it is valid to see everything that arises, and therefore everything that may arise in the future, which at that time will only arise in the present, as the only thing that is possible. And so attitudinally, we can relate to everything that happens in life as predetermined. And if we can adopt the attitude that whatever happens in life is predetermined, the actions of the other, the actions of this body, mind, organism, the emotions, the feelings, the thoughts, the illness or the good health, the good outcomes, the outcomes that we like, the outcomes we don't like, the outcomes we are criticized for, the outcomes we are praised for, the moving of the clouds, the sun shining, the bird dying, or the bird laying an egg and babies hatching. All of that is predetermined. All of that is the story of life unfolding. And so if our attitude can see whatever happens as predetermined, the resistance to life no longer has a foothold. The resistance to life is resistance which is based on an attitude that says life could have been different. Life should have been different. The other should be different. I should be different. So the more that we can appreciate that whatever happens is a happening according to God's will, according to life's will, according to the predetermined story of life, then the horizontal thinking that extends in time after the event is over, that keeps insisting that the event should have been different, that the past be different, that my actions in the past needed to be better. All of that is the psychological attitude towards what happened in the past and what might happen in the future of doership. And doership is the opposite. Predetermination says, I am aware, I as awareness am aware of the unfolding of the oneness of life. And that means the feeling in the body, the way the body responds to a situation is all part of the creation. And I am that which is aware of what was predetermined. The attitude of doership says, I, as the doer, determine how life turns out. Two completely different attitudes. The attitude of doership leads to guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. The attitude of seeing life as predetermined means that guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation are the grounds on which to arise when it's deeply known. It's like, what am I going to worry about? Life is going to turn out one way. What am I going to expect? I'd better off expecting life to turn out, which really means no expectation, because I know I don't know how life is going to turn out. So if it's only going to turn out one way, and I don't know which way that is, where is the place for an expectation? Coupled in with this is the importance of knowing ourselves outside of the relative dimension, where it becomes experientially known that however life turns out is largely irrelevant. That how life turns out is relative on the level of pleasure and pain. However, being grounded in this dimension outside of the relative, one knows oneself, one remains grounded and feels at peace, regardless of the pleasure or pain of the flow of life. So in summary, predetermination is a word interchangeable with non-duality, interchangeable with oneness, interchangeable with creation, interchangeable with life, interchangeable with God or source. God or source has turned into life. Life is a singularity, a creation. And that creation is predetermined, at least relative from the perspective of that which is aware of it, which is the essence of the human being. Destiny is another word for the predetermined story. So life will unfold according to destiny. You will function according to destiny. The outcomes you receive are destined, predetermined. Now, this idea of someone says, and there's great freedom in looking at life like that. If the doer that believes that their existence depends on being the one that creates life, if the doer that believes their happiness, their completeness, their survival, their salvation is to be found in life looking a certain way, if that psychological identity hears the notion of predetermined, it hates it. It feels completely challenged by it. The ground on which it stands is being taken away. If it believes it, if it runs with it, it is, in a sense, allowing its dissolution. So if it's heard by that identity, it says, no, that's terrible news. Because that is the end of that identity. The good news is that that identity is the root from which the suffering arises, the root from which our uncomfortableness with life arises. And happiness in life is the end of suffering, which means the end of that psychological identity that feels uncomfortable, that suffers. So seeing life as a predetermined story is actually great news, even if the identity that hears it and feels really bad, feels bad. It's great news. The identity that thinks it's bad news is, in fact, the suffering that can come to an end. So if the description is heard by a deeper part of ourselves that relaxes and says, oh, what a relief. Life is going to turn out one way. I don't need to look back at the past and judge myself. I don't need to hang on to the past, blaming the others for what they did to me, because I understand that they didn't have an independent existence from life. They couldn't have acted differently. That whatever they did is not really an attack on who I am. And this can be felt as we find this psychological identity dissolving, which means if the notion of predetermination and the notion that we exist on more than one level in life, that there is an aspect of the human being that exists on a quantum level or on a level that is not form, and we can start to feel that, then the stories of the past, the stories of the future become seen as these stories that were there to maintain a false sense of who we are, because it felt like that was needed, that was necessary, that was useful. Otherwise, who would I be? So if a deeper part of us hears this notion of predetermination and it surrenders us, it surrenders that thinking that is holding on to the past and looking into the future for salvation, that's when we start getting a taste of what freedom is. And in really practical terms, I often appreciate this when I'm in the garden doing some task like raking leaves, which is an ongoing process. Doing some task like, I don't know, landscaping an area that is not very well tended to and looked after. And I think that at some point in the near future or distant future, I'm going to be too old and too tired or too sick to be able to do those tasks. And then in a very short period of time, any effort that has been spent is sort of going to be washed away. The trees and the garden will overgrow. Someone will come and buy the property and knock down the house and flatten the garden and start from scratch. And so if we look at it like this, then we'd say, well, what's the point of me doing all of this? And in practice, though, I say, well, the funny thing is that if suffering has fallen away, it's not about the achievement. It's about the fact that we're doing something. And it's not that I'm doing gardening and gardening is a great activity. So we could pick a different activity other than gardening. It could be you at your desk at work. The amazing thing is not that what we're doing is so worthwhile, but rather that we're at peace while we're doing it. And that's the real gift, is if we're looking for the activity to be the thing that fulfills, when we really think about it, we'll go, well, what activity really worthwhile? Because whatever you end up doing is going to be washed away. It's not permanent. And so appreciating that it's not important that more leaves are going to fall and I'm going to have to rake again. It's not important that at some point I'm going to find that I have to let go of the garden and look back and say, oh, I wasted 30 years gardening because now it's all for nothing. What's important is to realize that for 30 years, I was at peace and I just happened to be doing gardening. And if we're not at peace, then we can't look back and say, it wasn't about the activity. It was about the fact that life was lived through those hours during the day, and life was lived at peace, with ease, flowing from the gardening to having to go and do some other work, to helping someone, to eating something, to feeling tired, maybe feeling sick sometime, and finding that life flowed. And that's what I find awe-inspiring when it's appreciated, is it's this simple peace with whatever's happening. That is the real gift, and not what it is that we're doing. So I spoke a lot today. We'll take one question and yes, then wrap it up. Oh, hello, Gaurav. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Hi.
Hi. First of all, it's great to see you after a long time again.
Yeah, nice to have you.
Yeah. My question is, today's satsang was more of a shift from the perspective where the pre-awakening, so to speak, where we know ourselves only as a body-mind, living in an objective world of space and time, to knowing ourselves as that in which the whole world arises. However, for me, that experiential shift has happened and has steadied over the past few years. Now, a slight bit of issue I have is then, as you said, coming back to functioning as the vehicle through which what we previously knew ourselves to be now functions. So the difficulty around that is, once we've seen awareness to be the subject of virtually everything which arises, and then we know ourselves to be that subject, essentially, to transfer the subjectivity back to what we previously knew as an object, which is the body mind, and then to relate to other body minds from that perspective seems to be a bit challenging. So I don't know if you can cover it in this satsang, or when just address a little bit of it.
Yes. So in order for that waking up to happen, the concepts that are delivered are concepts that include, for example, what you've just mentioned, reference to object and subject. And as you said, the awakening is to know ourselves as the subject, which is aware of the object that we previously believed ourselves to be and previously believed to be the subject. So the concept creates this this duality again of subject and object. And so we then come to know ourselves as the awareness. And by default, the concept has then made the body into just an object. And so it can seem like a challenge, or it might even seem like a regression to pick the object up again and somehow say, this is also who I am. And so maybe this description of how teachings use words to achieve something, but then those words can be seen to be not necessarily accurate from a different perspective. And that's why I'm introducing this notion of layers. So if we can then reinterpret those teachings that were so helpful to create the separation, to create the witnessing, to create an awakening to that subjective aspect that is not the body, if we can start to see that as a layer, that the awareness is a layer and the body is a layer of the human being or an aspect of the human being, and we realize, oh, what I am is not awareness. It sort of seems like a shame to talk about this at the end of this satsang, which is really a satsang that was wanting to emphasize the opposite of integration, but and emphasize more a separating into that which you've said has happened. So I'll say this, having said what I just said, which hopefully will allow someone to hear this part, maybe independent of the first part of the satsang, or at least hear it as a rounding off of a process that may not be relevant for several months or even years after the first part of the satsang has happened. So this notion that our thinking has to loosen up and start to be able to appreciate the whole on different layers, then means that we can say, oh, that's what it means. I am a human being. Because a human being is not saying that I am the body only or I am awareness only. The human being in this teaching says the human being is impersonal consciousness of source / awareness linked to a particular body-mind organism functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness, which is awareness. And so we are the human being, and we've always been the human being. The human being used to know itself as just a body. It only used to know the physical and maybe the thought aspect of the human being. And it was oblivious to the awareness aspect. And so the teachings say, look, how am I going to deal with this? This obsession that the human with the form, and this obsession with the flow of life, which is primarily form and outcomes. How do you deal with this? And the solution is to say, you are not the form, you are not the body, you are that which is aware of the form. And it's important. That's what the first half of the satsang, or the first 4/5 of the satsang today was. To maybe create a shift out of thinking that allows a recognition of this aspect of the human being that is the awareness. And often when that happens is we become identified with awareness, where there is essentially a resistance to acknowledging any of the form, any of the thoughts, any of the emotions as being anything to do with who I am. And so the integration is about an adjusting of our concept that is still in the system, such that it says, oh, you see, I always separate things. It was always about me and what's not me. And then we might say, oh yes, I have to live life as the human being. I have to live life as the vehicle through which consciousness is functioning, but understand that that consciousness doesn't exist in this experience of life independent from the vehicle. And that means, oh, this experience of life is to know myself as the person, to know myself as the body, and to be aware of life, including the physical sensations, etc. And at the end of the day, it's not really something you have to do. It's something that we might feel we have to do when the integration is a bit uncomfortable, when it feels like it's hitting some speed ups or getting stuck at, on a tight corner. And it's like, oh no, I have to, how do I fix this? How do I get myself unstuck? Whereas the reality is that you didn't get yourself stuck. That was just part of the process happening, which it continues to do day after day after day. And along that process, there are getting stuck, which is not something you're doing. It's just, and it feels uncomfortable. And then we kick in saying, oh, I need to figure this integrating thing out because this is the problem that I'm having. And that actually too is, part of destiny unfolded, part of the predetermined. And in time, the stuckness is going to become unstuck. And it's when we look back, and you can look back at your whole process, and you can look back at your process and no doubt find other times when there was a sense of stuckness, and realize that, and then I flowed past that point of stuckness. But did I flow past it because I figured it out, or because, it got figured out? And there's no doubt in my mind that that's what will continue to happen. The process carries on.
Yeah. A major stuck point was that initially when we know ourselves only as a body mind, that sort of, we know ourselves as an entity, so to speak. And then we speak to other body minds as entities. And during the awakening process, we know the only entity to be awareness. And then we essentially look for, we say that there's only one entity. So essentially, we can go as far as saying you're only talking to yourself whenever you're talking to somebody else, because the only person, the only entity listening there is awareness. And then that sort of gets you a bit stuck, because you sort of don't like that. You want to come back to a point of, living as an entity and relating to other people, other body mind as entities rather than activities, which they are seen to be from the point of view of awareness. I mean, you see thoughts arising, emotions arising, body, and you find that to be an activity more than an entity, if you know what I mean. So that's
sure, like a verb.
Yeah. As
Of
opposed to a noun.
noun.
Yeah.
The notion that we are awareness and that is the only entity, really, is a concept that if we hold it too absolutely, it's actually wrong. Well, the concept isn't wrong, but when we hold it too absolutely, it becomes knowing of life in a way that is going to be different to how I would say we will end up knowing life when the integration continues. And that's one of the tricks of insight, is that at different phases, we keep having new insight. And when we have insight in the moment, it feels like truth is revealed. And insight includes also these shifts. And so there is the shift where it feels like we know ourselves directly with no interference from anything relative, like no interference from thought. And so it seems like knowing myself as awareness is some sort of absoluteness. Until that changes, if that changes, not necessarily where we lose it and go back into a lost sense, but if it changes where we know ourselves differently, and we know ourselves differently and know that that is essentially a movement as part of the process, a movement beyond a particular point. And then we'll realize, at that point, that felt like truth. And now this feels like truth. And after that's happened enough times, we might end up saying, well, I don't know that anything is truth. I just know it feels like truth. And then it changes. So that's why I would say holding this notion, this concept that I know myself as awareness and that is the only entity, and therefore speaking to the other is more as an activity, and can only ever be an activity rather than an entity speaking to another entity. I would hold that a bit more loosely, because maybe that's not as absolutely true as it feels at a certain, point in time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I just wanted to clarify that point, because maybe it's going to the other end of the spectrum a little, wherein it's a bit of like a pendulum movement, wherein we move from one extreme to the other extreme. And I think it's somewhere about settling in the middle towards the end. Just the middle point is still not.
That's exactly what I would describe it as. The whole process is about actually swinging from one attachment, essentially, and then realizing it, that was an attachment and there was a belief, and that there is something different to that. And then we swing, I'm never doing that again. And we swing to its opposite, because when we sort of in breaking free from a belief, we sort of have to resist that. And then in resisting it, we go to the counter opposite. And this movement can happen on many layers in life, even those that seem like they aren't belief. When we end up on the awareness aspect of the human being and favoring that, it is an overshoot of the mark in a way. But it's a necessary overshoot, because it allows us to ground into that aspect that previously we had not much familiarity with, or no familiarity with. And it is about slowly coming back into what is balance, where the process reveals more and more where we might have overshot the mark and grabbed onto something that keeps us away from balance. And then we realize we're holding on, and it lets go, and we move closer back to center again. So I have no doubt, Gaurav, based on our interactions, that you can relax.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Roger. It's, as always, an absolute joy to see you and listen to your satsangs. Hopefully, I see you sometime in India soon.
Yes. Let's hope things go back to normal, and I'm there beginning of next year.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.